300 years. Gone. Not lost. Not forgotten. Removed. The number hit me before the implications did. 300 years. Roughly the span between the birth of Isaac Newton and the first moon landing. Potentially excised from the historical record with the precision of a scalpel and the silence of a closing archive door. I remember the exact moment I found the first thread. I was sitting in a university library in Leipzig, looking through something entirely unrelated, an old ecclesiastical land registry from Saxony, when a date stamped in faded red ink stopped me cold. The arithmetic didn't work. Not by a year, not by a decade, by generations. I didn't sleep that night, and I'm not sure I've slept soundly since. What follows is not a theory. It's a pattern, a series of anomalies, archival gaps, and chronological contradictions that, taken individually, are easy to dismiss. Taken together, they outline the shape of something enormous, something that suggests the timeline we've inherited, the one printed in every textbook and encoded in every civilization's founding mythology, may have been deliberately, systematically, and breathtakingly altered. Specifically, the period we casually call the early modern age, roughly 1700 to 1900, bears markers that keep me coming back. Markers that whisper, in the quiet language of dusty records and erased calendars, that something was inserted into time itself. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist, but once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The official story goes like this. Between the years 1700 and 1900, the Western world underwent a spectacular transformation. The Enlightenment reshaped philosophy and governance. The Industrial Revolution mechanized labor and exploded population centers. Revolutions, American, French, Haitian, rewrote the political architecture of empires. Science bloomed. Darwin, Faraday, Maxwell, Pasteur. Cities grew. Railways spread. The telegraph collapsed geography. By 1900, the world was, by every measurable standard, unrecognizable from what it had been 2 centuries prior. This is the mainstream account. It's taught in schools on every continent. It is, in many respects, awe-inspiring, this compressed cascade of human ingenuity across 200 years. Historians call it the fastest period of material change in recorded history, and that, in itself, deserves a longer look. Let me be fair to the official narrative. These events are documented. The patents exist. The newspapers survive. The philosophical treatises were printed, distributed, read. There is abundant material evidence for much of what we are told happened between 1700 and 1900. I am not suggesting that steam engines are fictional or that Napoleon was invented. What I am asking, and I think it's a question that deserves asking, is whether the chronology we've attached to these events is accurate. Whether the scaffolding of time itself, the numerical years assigned to these transformations, reflects a genuine and unaltered historical. What this means practically is that for nearly 200 years, the very years under discussion, different regions of the world were operating under fundamentally different numerical systems for recording dates. A letter sent from London in what the sender called March 12, 1700, would have been received in Moscow as March 1, 1700, 11 days earlier by their reckoning. Treaties were signed with dual dating. Court records carry 2 years, written as fractions. 1/12 February appears in English documents from the early 1700s, referring not to a date within a month but to the ambiguity between which year was actually current. Now here's what matters. If dates were already fluid, already contested, already wrong by design, who was keeping the authoritative record? Who was the ultimate arbiter of what year it actually was? The answer, in almost every case, is Rome, the Catholic Church, the Vatican's astronomers, its calendar commissions, its papal bulls and ecclesiastical councils. The same institution that, between 1582 and 1923, oversaw the calendar's global adoption. The same institution that, between those same years, was simultaneously navigating catastrophic political contraction, the dissolution of the Papal States, the Napoleonic Wars, the loss of temporal sovereignty, while maintaining, with remarkable consistency, its grip on time itself. I'm not suggesting conspiracy. I'm suggesting something more uncomfortable: structural incentive. Speaking of structural incentive, there's a man named Herbert Illig. In 1991, a German historian and publisher advanced what became known as the phantom time hypothesis. His argument, rigorously constructed if fiercely contested, was that approximately 297 years of the early medieval period, specifically AD 614 to 911, were fabricated, invented, inserted into the historical record through a coordinated effort involving the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, and the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII, all of whom had powerful political reasons to place themselves at the symbolic year 1000 AD. The academic establishment rejected Illig's thesis. Astronomers pointed to eclipse records and dendrochronological data, tree rings, that appeared to confirm the received timeline. The scholarly consensus held. But here's what no one explains. The same institutional apparatus that Illig accused of altering the medieval record was the one evaluating his evidence. The same universities trained on the same chronological assumptions were the ones declaring those assumptions sound. That's not necessarily corruption, but it is a closed loop. And closed loops in any system of inquiry deserve examination. Which brings me to something I found while researching something else entirely. In 1863, a Prussian historian named Wilhelm Wattenbach published a now obscure monograph on medieval manuscript transmission. In a footnote, he noted that an unusual number of foundational historical documents from the 8th and 9th centuries appeared to be copies of copies of copies, with no surviving originals, and that the copying had occurred overwhelmingly in a narrow institutional window between approximately 1720 and 1810. The originals, Wattenbach noted with academic calm, had been lost to fire, flood, or the dislocations of reform. Fire, flood, reform. 3 words that appear with remarkable frequency in the archival literature of the 18th century. 3 words that, together, constitute because these destructions cluster. They are not evenly distributed across historical time. They concentrate with unsettling specificity in the period between roughly 1780 and 1870. The age of revolution, the age of nationalism, the age of the modern nation-state which required, above all things, a usable past. A past that could be pointed to. A past that justified borders, legitimized dynasties, elevated ethnic mythologies into founding narratives. And a past, it is worth noting, that had to be constructed almost entirely from documents whose originals no longer existed. Let me be precise about what I'm describing. The 19th century was the golden age of the historical archive. Every major European nation established its national archive in this period. France in 1790. Britain's Public Record Office in 1838, the Prussian State Archives in 1803, the Vatican Secret Archive, technically ancient, was reorganized and significantly restricted in 1881. These institutions were not merely preserving the past. They were, with great deliberateness, selecting it, deciding which documents were authentic, which were forgeries, which were significant, and which would be filed in the lower vaults, sealed until conditions permitted their review. Some of those seals have never been broken. The part that keeps me up at night is the architecture. Not metaphorical architecture, literal architecture. The built environment of cities across Europe, North America, and the wider world contains structures that, by any honest technical assessment, should not exist given the timeline we've been given. I spent 3 weeks studying this. I want to be careful here because this is where the territory gets genuinely contested, and I don't want to collapse a legitimate historical question into something that can be dismissed with a single label. But consider the buildings attributed to the early 19th century city halls, train stations, universities, cathedrals, courthouses, routinely display construction techniques, material compositions, and architectural complexities that, according to the standard industrial timeline, postdate their supposed construction by decades. The mortar formulations tested in certain 1820 structures are chemically consistent with techniques not officially developed until the 1870s. Ventilation systems in buildings dated to the 1810s mirror engineering principles whose formal articulation occurs, in the textbook account, a full generation later. Maybe there are innocent explanations. Proto-industrial experimentation, regional knowledge clusters, gifted individual craftsmen working beyond the documented edge of their era. Maybe. But here's what matters. When researchers attempt to access the original construction contracts, the commissioning records, the payment ledgers that would definitively date these buildings, those documents are, with startling consistency, among the records lost to fire, flood, or reform. The pattern does not announce itself loudly. It accumulates, quietly, archive by archive, anomaly by anomaly, gap by gap. Which brings me to the most specific, most verifiable, and most disturbing thread in this investigation. The Russian Orthodox Church maintains, in its ecclesiastical records, a calendar tradition that runs parallel to, and historically independent of, the Western Gregorian system. These records, kept in monastery archives across Siberia and Central Asia, far from the political reach of European institutional reform, contain dating references that, when cross-referenced with their Western equivalents, produce a consistent discrepancy. Not an error, a discrepancy, meaning the gap is systematic, meaning it appears the same way in the same direction across dozens of independent archival sources. The discrepancy, averaged across the source material, hovers around connect the threads, a calendar system with known, documented gaps and deliberate date deletions, administered for centuries by a single political religious institution with unambiguous interest in chronological authority. A century, the 19th, defined by systematic archival construction coinciding with the destruction of primary sources. Buildings whose material evidence suggests a different timeline than their official dates. Russian ecclesiastical records producing a recurring discrepancy of almost exactly 3 centuries. And, at the foundation of it all, a German historian in 1991 arguing with mathematics that 297 years of history may have been fabricated. The number keeps appearing. 300 years. Not as a claim, as a pattern. Now consider what 300 years would mean specifically for the period we call the 1700s and 1800s. If those 2 centuries were, at least in part, constructed, padded, extended, elaborated to contain narratives that justified existing power arrangements, what would the world's actual chronology look like? When did the Renaissance really end? When, genuinely, did the Industrial Transformation begin? What were the authentic founding dates of institutions whose legitimacy rests on their antiquity? These are not rhetorical questions. They are practical questions. Because the answers would change everything. Every founding document, every territorial claim, every dynastic lineage, every assertion of cultural continuity that forms the bedrock of national identity on every inhabited continent. That's not academic. That's geopolitical. That's economic. That's, in the truest sense of the word, civilizational. And it would explain, with elegant simplicity, why the archives that might answer these questions remain sealed, scattered, or ash. I want to return, before I close, to that land registry in Leipzig. The document was a routine ecclesiastical record, a property transfer between 2 minor monasteries in Saxony. The kind of document that survives by sheer bureaucratic inertia, too dull to burn, too marginal to curate. And that, perhaps, is why it survived intact. No one thought it worth altering. The date stamped in red ink placed a building's construction in a year that, by standard chronological reckoning, came after a document referencing that building's renovations. The renovation predated the construction by 11 years, in the same continuous archival sequence, by the same institutional hand. 11 years. Small by the scales we've been discussing, but enough. Enough to suggest that whoever was maintaining these records had lost, or never possessed, precise command of the timeline they were inscribing. Or enough to suggest that they knew, and simply did not care, because the audience who would notice was never supposed to exist. That registry is still in Leipzig. sitting in a storage flat beneath the Sächsisches Staatsarchiv, accessible to credentialed researchers, uncatalogued in any digital finding aid. I know because I asked. I know because the archivist paused, a long, careful pause, before confirming that yes, the document exists, and yes, it is technically available, but that formal access requires a written institutional request, a waiting period of 4 to 6 weeks, and the specification of research purpose. It is buried in plain sight, but I keep thinking about what it would take to alter a timeline. Not in a single dramatic act, that would be impossible, and its impossibility is the first defense anyone raises. I'm not imagining a single meeting in a single room where men in robes decided to delete 300 years and shook hands on it. I'm imagining something slower, more organic, more human. The accumulation of thousands of small decisions, which documents to preserve, which to copy, which to date, which to file where, made over decades by institutions with understandable, even sympathetic reasons to want a usable past. The way a river reshapes a valley. Not through intention, but through the persistent pressure of interest on the soft stone of record. That's not a conspiracy. That's a process. And processes leave traces. The traces are there. In Leipzig, in the Vatican's lower vaults, sealed until conditions permit. In the monastery archives of Siberia, producing their quiet, consistent, 300-year discrepancy. In the construction records that no longer exist for buildings that should not have been buildable when history says they were built. The pattern is there. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. What I'm